She claimed I wasn't a real dad, so the papers erased her future. The sentence echoed in my head louder than the thunder rattling the windows of my Cincinnati home that night, as if the storm outside had borrowed the words and hurled them back at me with every flash of lightning. I stood in my study, tie loosened, collared shirt damp from rain I hadn't realized had followed me in from the porch, and stared at the folder on my desk like it was some kind of living animal waiting to strike. The air smelled of wet oak and inked two things that had marked most of my adult life, and my hand hovered above the papers, reluctant to touch them because I knew once I signed, nothing about my daughter's future would look the same. Or maybe I should say the girl I thought was my daughter, because earlier that day, in a voice dripping with disdain, Alyssa had laughed in front of her friends and said the words I can't erase. "You're not my real dad." It wasn't the first time she had said it, not even the first time she'd used it as a weapon when she was angry, but it was the first time she'd made it public, the first time she'd wielded it like a badge of honor, like proof that she could erase me with nothing more than her tongue and a crowd. That mattered because the trust documents stacked on my desk didn't just exist in theory, they carried a clause I had written in cold ink after too many nights of casual insults. The clause that said any public rejection of me as her father would automatically trigger a reallocation of the funds I had spent my life building. Some might call it petty. I called it structural, a quiet kind of safeguard against a truth I had seen coming but never wanted to admit. And now, thanks to one careless moment broadcasted through the cruel speed of campus gossip, the condition had been met. I thought of the birthdays, the scraped knees, the nights of fever when I held her hand and prayed she'd breathe easy, and it all clashed with the smirk she wore when she said it like she believed words could make me disappear. My jaw tightened as another bolt of lightning lit the room, reflecting my own face back at me in the glass of a framed photo. Me, her, and her late mother, all smiles at a county fair. In that picture I looked like a father. In the eyes of the law, I was. But in her words, I was nothing. That's when the storm outside felt like it was inside me too, not rage. Not grief, but something sharper, calmer, like resolve. I wasn't going to shout or beg. I wasn't going to ask her to reconsider. I was going to do what I had been preparing to do for years, quietly, without theater, because sometimes the most permanent justice comes not with raised voices, but with ink. And so I sat, pen in hand, and drew a line beneath her name. Not angrily, not vengefully. Simply with the kind of precision that comes from finally accepting who someone has decided to be. I signed once, twice, 3 times, initials in the margins, each stroke as deliberate as breathing. When it was done, I didn't slam the folder shut, didn't pour a drink, didn't pace the floor. I just sat there in the stillness between thunderclaps, listening to the storm, knowing her future had shifted in that moment, not because I was cruel, but because she had chosen the stage on which to deny me. The storm raged outside, but inside I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. And now I'll ask you, where are you watching from tonight? Which city, which state carries storms of its own, storms that remind you of family words you'll never forget? By the next morning, the storm had cleared, but the damage hadn't, because betrayal doesn't wait for the rain to stop. It moves faster than water, faster than wind. It moves like rumor. I woke to a phone vibrating on the nightstand. 3 missed calls from my sister, 2 texts from an old family friend, and a voicemail from my cousin who just wanted to check in, which is code for, "I heard something, and I want to know if it's true." By noon, I realized I didn't even need to check social media to understand what had happened. One careless moment at a dorm, one cruel line dropped into the noise of a Bluetooth speaker, and suddenly half the family tree was bending under the weight of whispered doubt. At the grocery store, a neighbor gave me a smile that was just a little too polite. At the bank, the teller avoided my eyes. At the diner, an old friend who usually slid into my booth for coffee waved awkwardly from a distance instead. That's how betrayal spreads. It doesn't shout. It doesn't march down the street with banners. It drips, drip by drip, into conversations at kitchen tables and over car rides, until suddenly the people you thought knew you best are squinting at you, wondering if maybe they missed something. And in my case, it wasn't just my reputation at stake, it was decades of fatherhood being put on trial in the court of public opinion, judged by relatives and acquaintances who had no business playing jury. The house itself felt different that day, quieter, heavier, like it was listening. Picture frames on the wall seemed to accuse me, the smiles frozen in glass reminding me of the years I couldn't erase even if I wanted to. Every step down the hallway was a reminder of what I had built: bedtime stories, packed lunches, late-night drives to rehearsals, and how easily one sentence could be used to dismantle it all. At one point, my neighbor across the street, a man I had known for 20 years, leaned against his mailbox and asked too casually, "So, how's Alyssa doing up at college?" The pause before I answered was enough for him to know everything. That's the cruelty of rumor. You don't have to defend yourself against facts. You have to defend yourself against tone, against silence, against the way people start to tilt their heads when they look at you. And the cruelest part was this. She knew exactly what she was doing. That line, "You're not my real dad," wasn't an accident. It wasn't the heat of an argument. It was strategy, a way to pull a thread loose in front of an audience, to make sure the unraveling wasn't private but witnessed. She had planted a seed of doubt not just in me but in everyone who had ever watched me raise her, who had seen me clap at recitals, who had sat across from me at family holidays while she called me dad. Now they were revising their own memories, wondering if maybe they had imagined the connection. Maybe I had insisted on a role that was never mine to claim. That's what betrayal does. It doesn't just rewrite the present, it vandalizes the past. I could feel it happening in real time, the warmth of her childhood, the trust of those years, being painted over by the fresh coat of her public rejection. And yet, in the quiet of my study, as the sun stretched across the desk and lit the blue folder waiting for my signature, I realized that this wasn't just her test of me, it was my test of myself. Could I hold my ground without shouting, without begging, without crumbling in the face of family whispers? Could I trust the very structure I had put in place for this exact moment, knowing full well people would misunderstand, accuse me of cruelty, accuse me of spite? The clause wasn't about spite, it was about clarity. It was about making sure that respect mattered as much as money, that inheritance couldn't be claimed by someone who openly denied the bond it was built on. Still, it stung because I wanted someone, anyone, in that family web of cousins and aunts and uncles to call and say, "We know who you are. We know what you've done. We stand with you." No one did. Silence became its own verdict. And that's when I realized something else. The court of public opinion might never side with me, but the actual court, the documents, the signatures, they would. That was the only jury I needed. Still, as I closed the blinds that night, shutting out the world and its whispers, I couldn't help but wonder, have you ever felt your own family turn into spectators, watching your life as if it were a scandal to discuss over coffee? Have you ever wondered how quickly loyalty turns to gossip when just one person decides to rewrite the story? Memory is a cruel editor. It cuts, splices, rewinds, and plays scenes you didn't ask to watch, and that week, as whispers circled my name, I found myself ambushed by flashbacks I couldn't turn off. I saw her as a little girl again, hair tangled after recess, running into the kitchen with scraped knees and tears streaming down her face, and me crouching to clean the gravel from her skin while she asked, "Do you think it'll leave a scar?" I told her scars were proof you had fought through something, that they meant you were strong. She believed me then, believed every word I said, the way children do when they still see you as a hero. I remembered the piano bench, her legs too short to reach the pedals, her frustration bubbling until she slammed her hands on the keys. I sat beside her, showed her how to play with elbows just for a laugh, and her giggle filled the room like sunlight through dusty blinds. I remembered Christmas mornings when she tore open wrapping paper with unfiltered joy, never asking how many late nights I had worked to afford the gifts, just assuming magic delivered them. I remembered sitting in emergency rooms, holding her hand through asthma attacks, counting her breaths like beads on a rosary, whispering encouragements while machines beeped in steady rhythm. Those moments weren't about obligation. They were about love, about choosing every single day to show up for a child who wasn't mine by blood but was mine by everything else. And yet, when she laughed in front of her dorm friends, when she tore that card in half, it was as though she had reached back through time and ripped those memories apart too. making them look smaller, weaker, like figments of my imagination. That's what stung, not just her words, but the ease with which she discarded the very foundation of her life, as if devotion could be edited out like an unwanted character in a photograph. I thought about the countless rides to school, the packed lunches with notes tucked inside notes she sometimes rolled her eyes at but secretly kept in a shoebox until she decided they were embarrassing and threw them away. I thought of the nights I stayed awake while she studied for exams, keeping the light on in the hallway just so she didn't feel alone. I remembered paying tuition bills, filling out scholarship applications, sitting in financial aid offices while she complained about cafeteria food, never realizing the hours it took just to make sure she had a shot at her dreams. Every sacrifice felt like bricks laid into a house she chose to burn down with one sentence. "You're not my real dad," and yet I couldn't erase the warmth of those memories from myself. They weren't wasted. They were just unrecognized. Still, part of me longed for acknowledgement, for some trace that she had ever seen what I did for her. That's when I thought of the letter, the one my sister-in-law had found years ago. A letter written in Alyssa's messy 8th grade handwriting. "You're not my real dad, but you're the closest thing I'll ever have to one, and I hope I make you proud." I kept that letter tucked in my blazer pocket, not because I needed proof of who I was, but because it reminded me that somewhere, at least once, she had seen me. That memory gave me strength in the face of whispers, even if it also sharpened the pain of her later denial. Because the truth is, love isn't measured by how many gifts you buy or how many bills you pay. It's measured by presence, by consistency, by the quiet way you show up when no one else does. And I had shown up every time, which is why the papers on my desk weren't acts of cruelty, but acts of alignment. They were the bridge between love and respect, and when one collapsed, the other couldn't carry the weight alone. Signing them wasn't about punishing her, it was about protecting the years of sacrifice from being trampled, about ensuring they meant something, even if she refused to see it. And that brings me to you. Listening now, have you ever given everything to someone who later acted like it was nothing? Have you ever felt your sacrifices erased in a single careless moment? If I thought her words would pass like a storm, fading into memory after a day or two, I underestimated how betrayal evolves in the modern world. Because it doesn't settle quietly anymore. It multiplies and echoes until it becomes a performance judged by strangers. By the end of that week, Alyssa's dismissal of me wasn't just a line thrown in a dorm common room. It was a video clip stitched together with laughter and uploaded to social media where it took on a life of its own. A shaky 12-second recording of her tearing my card in half while her friends howled in the background, captioned with a phrase that cut deeper than the paper itself. "When your stepdad tries too hard, hashtag not my real dad, double quotes." At first it felt like nothing more than a careless joke broadcast to her small circle of friends. But within days, the numbers on the screen told a different story, thousands of views. Then tens of thousands, comments piling beneath it like gravel burying the truth. People I had never met weighing in on my life as if they had been in our kitchen during the hard years. Typing words like pathetic or savage as though they had earned the right to define me. That was the sting I hadn't prepared for, not her rejection, which I had braced against for years, but the way an audience of strangers could be invited to cheer it on. Love had always been private, but humiliation was suddenly public, and public always drowns private. My phone filled with notifications, not from her, but from people forwarding the clip, tagging me with pity, or sending cautious messages like "kids say things they don't mean," except she did mean it because she doubled down. She didn't delete the video or apologize. Instead, she posted more memes about Father's Day, quips about stepdad energy, inside jokes about our family dinners recast as absurd anecdotes. Each post wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration, and each one reached further than the last, until even colleagues at work and parents at church were giving me the sort of tight smiles that say they'd heard enough to wonder if it was true. That's how betrayal spreads, not like fire but like smoke, filling every room, slipping under every door, until people who once saw you clearly start to squint through the haze and doubt their own memory of who you were. And while I wanted to believe I could ignore it, the truth was that every repost, every whisper, every glance carried a weight, pressing on me when I stood in line at the grocery store, when I filled my gas tank, when I bowed my head in the pew on Sunday. But here is what she didn't realize, what no one around her understood. Every cruel flourish she broadcast wasn't just humiliation, it was documentation. I didn't argue online, didn't craft some defensive statement, didn't confront her in a text thread. Instead, I printed the screenshots, recorded the links, cataloged the dates and times of every post, because the blue folder in my desk drawer didn't care about feelings or reputation. It cared about evidence, and the clause buried in those papers wasn't triggered by rumor, but by proof. She thought she was painting me as an outsider to her life, that all she was doing was signing her own confirmation that the rejection was public, deliberate, undeniable. While she chased likes and comments, I stacked pages, building a quiet case she would never see coming, because I knew the fight wasn't in the court of public opinion. It was in the institutions that deal not in gossip but in signatures. And so while her laughter echoed across timelines, I kept my silence. At night, I walked the hallway past her empty room, the lavender walls still lined with posters and trophies that smelled faintly of her old perfume, the kind she used to spray before school dances. And the scent itself felt like mockery now, a reminder of all the years I had given that she was willing to erase with a hashtag. Outside, kids in the neighborhood shot hoops in the driveway, their voices loud and unfiltered, and I wondered whether this was what fatherhood had become in this age, measured not by consistency or sacrifice, but by the way it could be reframed online into a joke. The loneliness pressed in heavy, but beneath it was resolve, because I understood what she didn't. Storms look violent while they rage, but they end, and what matters is who is left standing when the sky's clear. And so I chose not to fight her in the arena she had chosen, because spectacle was her weapon, and silence was mine. Silence doesn't trend, but silence waits. And silence coupled with structure outlives every laugh, every cruel comment, every fleeting moment of applause. That was the lesson she didn't see, that permanence doesn't come from an audience. It comes from ink and law and the kind of preparation I had done in secret for years. I won't say it was easy. I still woke in the night with my chest heavy, still felt my jaw tighten when I caught sight of her smiling face in an old photograph, still heard the echo of her voice calling me not real, but every pang of pain reminded me why the folder existed, why the clauses were written, why the trust had been built the way it had, not to punish but to protect. And as the days rolled forward and the views climbed higher, I sat calmly at my desk, flipping through pages, telling myself that the higher the video soared, the faster the fall would come, because she wasn't dismantling me with those words, she was dismantling herself. Which brings me to you listening now. Have you ever watched someone tear you down publicly while you kept your silence, knowing in your bones that the truth you had built was stronger than any laugh or whisper they could conjure? When the noise grew too loud to ignore, I did what I had always done in difficult seasons. I retreated into structure, into the quiet discipline of paperwork and process, because while Alyssa sought attention through spectacle, my strength had always been in preparation. The first thing I did was pull the blue folder from the drawer again, the one that had sat patiently for months, waiting for the day when it would be more than precaution, and I spread its contents across the desk like a map. There were color-coded tabs, neatly indexed pages, forms prepared years earlier by a paralegal who hadn't asked why I needed such specific clauses, but who had drafted them with the kind of precision I paid extra for. In black ink on cream paper was the clause that mattered most. In the event of a public act of deliberate rejection, the trust shall be dissolved as to the named beneficiary and redirected to the secondary program. Reading it again didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me feel steady, as if I had finally stepped onto ground that would hold me. But words on a page were not enough. I needed them activated, enforced, witnessed. So the next morning I drove downtown, past the courthouse steps slick with last night's rain, and into the office tower where Hinrich and Cole kept their suite of glass-walled conference rooms. The air smelled of burnt coffee and new carpet, the sterile perfume of legal corridors, and as I sat in the waiting area, I realized how calm I felt. Not vindicated, not vengeful, just calm, because for the first time in years, The terms of our relationship were not being rewritten by her moods, they were being set in ink. When the attorney, a woman named Catherine Nguyen with sharp eyes and a voice that could slice through pretense, greeted me with a firm handshake, I handed her the folder without preamble. "It's time," I said, and she understood without asking. She flipped through the evidence quickly, her nails tapping lightly against the screenshots I had printed, the notarized trust revisions, the donation agreement already signed. "You've been preparing," she said, almost with admiration. I nodded once. I had to. We spent hours reviewing, cross-referencing, ensuring that every condition had been satisfied, every loophole sealed. She explained the timeline. Letters of termination to be sent by certified mail, notification to the university's endowment office, automatic redirection of funds into the Langford Scholars Program. By the time we were done, the path was set, and it wasn't a matter of opinion anymore, it was law. That was the difference between her world and mine. She had followers, I had filings. She had hashtags, I had clauses. She had applause, I had permanence. Still, when I left the office, walking past clerks with their rolling briefcases and assistants clutching coffee trays, I felt a flicker of grief, because strategy is cold comfort against the warmth of a child's hand you once held. Yet I pressed on, because I understood now that protecting my legacy didn't mean protecting her feelings. It meant protecting the principle that love cannot be mocked without consequence. At home, I scanned the documents again, filed them neatly, and called the assistant director of donor relations at the university. "It's finalized," I said. "Proceed with the dedication." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause where someone realizes they are stepping into the middle of a personal war disguised as philanthropy. But she didn't press. "Yes, Mr. Langford," she said. "We'll handle everything." That evening I sat alone in the kitchen, the faint smell of rosemary still clinging to the air from a meal I had cooked out of habit, though no one was there to eat it, and I thought about how strange it was that justice could look like quiet signatures on dry paper. It didn't roar, it didn't demand attention, it simply waited until the time came to act. And I knew the time had come. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to defend myself in living rooms or comment sections, because the truth was now woven into documents that could not be undone. And so I'll ask you, listening now, have you ever had to fight back, not with noise or anger, but with structure? Have you ever chosen to let quiet preparation become your defense when the world wanted you to break in public? Monday arrived with the kind of artificial cheer only campuses can manufacture. A morning of weak coffee and styrofoam cups, bagels gone stale by the time they were sliced, and undergraduates pretending to be more awake than they were. But for Alyssa, it was just another routine obligation, one of those donor breakfasts she tolerated because professors expected her to show face. She walked into the atrium of the music wing with her phone in one hand, scrolling through likes on the TikTok that mocked me, blissfully unaware that her performance had already triggered a chain reaction she couldn't control, and as she adjusted her silk blouse and smoothed her hair, she barely noticed the rectangle on the wall, covered in burgundy cloth, flanked by a few administrators and a university photographer. But when Dean Travers, with his horn-rimmed glasses and PBS smile, called her name and asked her to join them for a special unveiling, she felt a flicker of curiosity, maybe even pride, thinking she was being honored for some recital, some achievement, until he gestured toward the cloth and said, "This morning we recognize a contribution that has touched every corner of this department." And with a quick pull, the cloth dropped to reveal the bronze plaque, the light catching on the etched letters, and suddenly the air in the room tilted because there, carved permanently into metal just outside her favorite practice room, were the words in honor of true fatherhood, Richard A. Langford. The sound of polite applause rose around her, professors clapping, freshmen whispering, a photographer snapping frames, and Alyssa froze mid-step, her phone slipping slightly in her hand, her mouth open but no words forming, because in an instant she understood this wasn't a gesture. She could crop out of a photo or spin with a caption. This was immovable, permanent, and witnessed by everyone in the room. Whispers bloomed at the edges. "Isn't that her stepdad?" Someone murmured, and another voice, lower but audible, said, "I thought she hated him." And Alyssa felt heat crawl up her neck. her polished confidence fracturing under the weight of a truth she had never expected to be written into stone. Dean Travers leaned closer, his tone gentle but firm. "It's a beautiful tribute, don't you think?" And the word tribute clanged in her ears like an off-key note, because what was meant as recognition felt to her like exposure, the quiet unveiling of everything she had tried to erase. Her knees buckled. Professor Levin caught her elbow, murmuring if she was all right, but she brushed him off too quickly, her smile stretched too thin, her fingers trembling as she tucked her hair behind her ear while inside her chest the realization spread. Her mockery had been converted into evidence, her cruelty into a trigger, her dismissal into the very clause that erased her claim. Students she barely knew began snapping pictures of the plaque. 2 freshmen forming heart signs with their fingers beside it, the university photographer angling for a wide shot, and each click of the camera felt like a nail sealing her out of the narrative she thought she controlled. She pushed through the crowd, the whispers following like smoke, stumbled into the hallway, pressed her back against the cold cement, and tried to breathe. But the word permanent looped in her head like a broken refrain. Permanent until the thought hollowed her. By the time she returned to her dorm that evening, the university's Instagram had already posted a carousel, the plaque, the dean smiling, captions with hashtags like #TrueFatherhood and #LangfordLegacy, and comments flooding in with praise, strangers calling the story inspiring, calling me a mentor, a guardian, a builder of futures, and none of them knew the TikTok, none of them knew the cruel words, none of them saw the card she had torn, they only saw the permanence of bronze. Her phone buzzed with messages she didn't answer. Her fingers hovered over my number, but she didn't call, and when she finally sent a text, it was long, frantic, filled with punctuation she never used, accusations of humiliation, claims that I could have talked to her, complaints about how public it was, but no apology, no reflection, no recognition of the years behind it. I read it once, set the phone face down, and returned to my book, because I had no need to reply. The plaque was my answer, the clause was my answer, the silence was my answer. And now I'll ask you, if you had the chance to make the truth permanent, to carve it in bronze so it could never again be mocked or denied, would you take it, even if it meant that someone who betrayed you would have to see it every single day? The envelope was heavier than its size suggested, cream-colored with an embossed law firm logo at the top left corner, and when Alyssa picked it up from the dorm mail desk, she thought for a moment it might be something ordinary, a delayed birthday card or another irrelevant flyer from career services. But when she tore it open in the elevator and saw the heading Langford Educational Trust, beneficiary status termination, her stomach dropped with the force of gravity doubled, and by the time the elevator doors slid open, she was leaning against the metal wall, reading and rereading the first lines as if they might change with enough passes, effective immediately. Pursuant to Clause 7.4b, your access to disbursements has been terminated. Condition met by verified public rejection of parental guardianship. Funds redirected to the Langford Scholars Program. The words were clinical, bloodless, typed in crisp font that offered no mercy, and yet they carried more finality than any shouting match. Because this wasn't opinion, it was law, notarized, and enforceable. She stumbled into her room, locked the door, collapsed onto her bed with the letter clutched like a live wire, scanning it again for loopholes, for an appeal contact, for any language that offered reversal, but there was none. The letter explained with sterile efficiency that the trust had already been redirected, that the decision was final, that her only recourse was to apply to the bursar's office for hardship review if she needed emergency financial aid. Her hands trembled as she flipped the page, hoping for my signature, some trace of emotion, but there was only the typed name of my attorney, as if I had already stepped out of the story and left only institutions to speak for me. Panic rose in her chest like a tide, sharp and metallic, because she had always assumed that even in anger I would still be there as a safety net. Still, the one to quietly cover tuition, to refill meal accounts, to wire money for books. But now the safety net was gone, and in its place was a trapdoor. She called Marlene first, her voice high and brittle. "Why didn't you tell me? You knew, you must have known." But Marlene's silence was longer than her outrage, and when she finally spoke, it was blunt. "I didn't tell him to do this." Alyssa, you did. Alyssa hung up before more could be said, but the words echoed in her head anyway. She tried the dean next, writing a desperate email about emotional distress, about unfair representation, about context, but the reply came back within 12 minutes. Polite but firm. The plaque and the redirection of funds were executed per donor agreement and cannot be altered without the donor's request. Further appeals unnecessary. Each attempt to push back collapsed against the same wall. Permanence. That night she scrolled through the university's Instagram post, the carousel of smiling students in the music wing, the plaque gleaming, my name captioned with hashtags like #TrueFatherhood and #LangfordLegacy, and she clicked the comments compulsively. Strangers praising me, strangers calling the story inspiring, not knowing what she had said, not caring, because the narrative wasn't hers anymore. She paced her dorm room barefoot, her phone buzzing with messages she ignored, her reflection in the window jagged and foreign, and she whispered to herself, "He can't do this. He can't." But the truth was that I already had, and the more she repeated it, the more the phrase lost shape, until it sounded like the background hum of a fridge, meaningless noise in a room where permanence had already been installed. The next morning she woke to a university announcement in her inbox. The Langford Scholars Program officially launched. Full scholarships for students from single-parent households, priority given to those who demonstrated respect and resilience. And she realized with a sick twist that her own name would never appear on that list, that the funding once earmarked for her was already securing someone else's tuition, someone who would walk past that plaque each morning and thank me with a sincerity she had never offered. She thought about calling me then, but her pride built a wall taller than her panic. So instead she typed a text half apology, half accusation, deleted it, typed again, deleted again, until the screen went black from inactivity and her own reflection stared back at her, hollow-eyed. She wasn't crying, not yet, because crying required an admission of loss, and she was still clinging to denial like a life raft. But denial couldn't pay tuition, denial couldn't erase legal clauses. Denial couldn't change that every financial form she filled out now would be reviewed by strangers who saw her not as a daughter but as a case. That was the cruelest cut. She had mocked me for being just the guy who pays the bills. And now, stripped of that support, she had to face what it meant to be on her own. She searched her bank app compulsively, calculating balances, subtracting rent and books, realizing with a shiver that the numbers no longer stretched, and she muttered to herself, "He planned this." He waited, but deep down she knew it wasn't sudden. It was the accumulation of years, the slow ledger of disrespect finally balanced. And so I'll turn to you. Listening now, have you ever dismissed someone's effort, mocked what they gave you, only to learn too late that it was the foundation under your feet, and when that foundation was pulled away, did you realize just how much of your future was built on a love you refused to acknowledge? The quiet after a storm never feels like triumph. It feels like stillness, like the air pausing to acknowledge what has shifted, and that was what my life became once the plaque was mounted and the trust redirected. Days that unfolded without raised voices, without frantic texts I felt obliged to answer, without the constant background hum of waiting for a small kindness that never came. My mornings returned to ritual, the kettle whistling, the scent of dark roast filling the kitchen, the newspaper folded neatly on the counter. I no longer checked my phone for her name. Instead, I checked for updates from the university, progress reports from the endowment office, photographs of the first Langford scholars receiving their awards. Those students, wide-eyed and earnest, shaking hands in photos where my name appeared on a banner, reminded me why I had built the structure in the first place. It wasn't about punishing Alyssa. It was about ensuring that what I poured into the world landed somewhere it could grow. The irony was that permanence had freed me not because I had erased her, but because I had finally stopped trying to hold a place in her story where she had written me out long ago. Yet the echoes of her remained, not in anger but in memory, the way grief leaves fingerprints even after years. Sometimes I walked past the shelf where her old music trophies still sat, the dust softening the shine, and I would wonder if she ever walked past the plaque and felt the same tug in her chest. I suspected she did, though not out of gratitude. More likely it was the sting of recognition, the discomfort of permanence. The realization that her attempt to erase me had backfired into the opposite. I had become part of her environment in a way she could never edit. People ask me occasionally, colleagues or distant friends, if I regretted the severity of the decision, if I wished I had left a door open for reconciliation, and my answer was always the same. The door had never been mine to close. It had been hers, and she had slammed it in public. What I did was not retribution, it was administration, the fulfillment of a promise. I made to myself the night she laughed over FaceTime and called me a golden retriever with a credit card. I had promised that the next time she dismissed me there would be a cost, not for her words but for her pattern. And when the TikTok surfaced, when the Father's Day card was torn, the cost arrived. She learned then that not all bridges can be rebuilt, not all nets will catch you a second time, and I learned that letting go does not always look like release. Sometimes it looks like documents filed, clauses executed, plaques mounted. In the months that followed, our contact dwindled to silence. She sent one last message in December, a brief line that said, "I wish things were different," and I stared at it for a long time before closing my phone without reply. Not out of cruelty, but out of recognition that the past was not a place I could live in anymore. My present was in the faces of students who shook my hand with sincerity, in the letters from single mothers thanking me for scholarships that gave their children a chance, in the music that filled the recital hall I had quietly helped build. I found peace in the permanence of those choices. And Alyssa, well, she found herself facing a future without the scaffolding she thought invisible. That was her lesson, one she may never thank me for, but one that will shape her nonetheless. Because love, when unacknowledged, does not disappear. It transforms, it redirects, it finds soil where it can grow. And so I'll leave you with this. If you were in my place, would you have done the same? Would you have chosen permanence over pleading, structure over sentiment, consequence over compromise? Or would you have kept waiting for respect that never arrived? Tell me, because in the end, stories like this are not about villains or heroes, but about the weight of choices and the legacy we leave when patience finally runs out.